Horace Vale tore Clara Wynn's brass nameplate from the telegraph desk, while smoke from the wreck still blackened the depot windows. "You cleared that train into Blackcut," he said. "You're dismissed." Before Clara could answer, the silent sounder snapped to life and clicked out an order. "Line clear through Blackcut. Proceed Juniper." It was the same false clearance that had sent the passenger cars off the rail 3 hours earlier, and it carried the same dragged pause before the final word. Clara lunged for the key. Vale seized the wire cutters. "That line is dead!" Luke Barrett caught his wrist before the blades touched copper. "Then let her prove it." Clara drove a warning down the wire to Mason Ridge. "Stop number 4. Hold all traffic." The station bell answered. Far beyond town, an engine whistle gave one long cry and fell silent. Then the unknown sender tapped again. "Order received, CW." Clara's initials. Her private signature. Someone on that wire knew exactly how she worked, and wanted the next wreck blamed on her too. For one breath, no one in the Red Mesa depot moved. Vale's silver mustache twitched. His hand remained trapped in Luke's grip, the wire cutters open between them. Around the desk stood a dozen townspeople who had come in from the wreck site with soot on their faces and blood on their sleeves. They had heard the fatal order repeat while Clara's hands were still in plain sight. Clara released the telegraph key. Her fingers were steady, though the rest of her felt hollow. "Mason Ridge has number 4, she said. "They've stopped her before the west switch." Station agent Ned Pollard leaned toward the sounder as if it might bite him. "The dispatcher said he opened the circuit." "He opened the main circuit," Clara replied. "That signal came in on a live branch." Vale pulled against Luke's grip. "Release me, Barrett." Luke did, but he took the cutters first and laid them behind Clara's record book. He was a tall, rangy man in a scorched canvas coat, with a split at one eyebrow from hauling passengers through a broken coach window. He had spent the afternoon carrying people out of Blackcut. Now he planted both scarred hands on the desk and looked at Vale without lowering his eyes. "She just kept another train out of that cut," he said, after sending the signal herself. Vale turned toward the witnesses. "A clever performance does not erase negligence." Clara looked past him to the depot windows. Smoke drifted above the low ridge west of town. The passenger train had struck a work engine in the narrow cut. 11 people were injured. Young fireman Samuel Croft had died before the doctor could reach him. His death sat heavier on Clara than every accusing face in the room. But grief did not change the sound she had heard. "I did not send the first order," she said. "And I did not send this one." Vale held up the train order sheet recovered from the wreck. "Your initials are written here." "Written," Clara said, "not sent." She drew the sheet toward her. The paper was creased and dirty with cinders. Beneath the order stood CW in a cramped hand that resembled hers only if a man had seen it once and trusted memory more than practice. "My W closes high," she said. "That one closes low, and the sender's R drags. Mine never does." Pollard swallowed. He knew she was right. Every telegraph operator along the Santa Teresa and Western had a rhythm as recognizable as a voice. Clara had worked the Red Mesa key for 7 years. She could identify the hurried fist at Mason Ridge, the musical spacing of the dispatcher in Santa Teresa, and the nervous double tap of a new operator at Juniper Wells. The false sender belonged to none of them. Vale snatched up her brass nameplate. "You are no longer employed by this railroad. Leave the office." Clara rose. At 34, she had long ago learned how a crowded room measured a woman before it heard her. Their eyes took in her soft, round face, her full arms beneath the sleeves of her green wool dress, her broad waist and generous hips. Some saw warmth. Some saw a woman built for comfort, not command. Vale had always seen an easy person to blame. She took the nameplate from his fingers. "You may dismiss me," she said. "You may not use my name to kill another crew." The room went quiet again. Vale ordered Pollard to lock the key. Then he told everyone an examiner would arrive from the division office by noon the next day. Until then, no one was to touch railroad property or travel the right-of-way without his written permission. Clara heard the trap beneath the procedure. Vale controlled the office, the line riders, the records, and every door that might hold proof. By noon, the examiner would find only what Vale allowed him to find. She tucked her nameplate into her pocket and walked outside. Late daylight fell hard and clear across Red Mesa. The town had grown around the railroad, a water tower, a stock pen, 2 streets of timber buildings, and a red stone ridge that forced the track through Black Cut. People moved between the depot and the improvised infirmary in the hotel dining room. No one called to Clara. Luke followed her onto the platform. "Where would a live branch come from?" he asked. She studied him. "Vale will dismiss you too if you keep asking that." "He already did." Luke opened his scorched coat and showed her the folded work notice in his shirt pocket. "Bridge foreman is expected to agree with the division superintendent." "And you didn't." "I know what I saw at the cut. The work engine had orders to hold. The passenger crew believed the line was clear. 2 orders put 2 trains in the same place." Clara looked west. Telegraph wire ran beside the track, black against the pale sky. "A hidden branch needs a splice, a battery, and a key." The signal sounded weaker than the dispatcher's line. It came from west of us. "Juniper relay hut is west. 9 miles. I have 2 horses." She almost refused. She had spent years proving she could lift her own battery box, keep her own records, and solve her own failures. Too many men offered help as a way of taking command. Luke seemed to read the hesitation. "You tell me where to ride," he said. "You tell me what to carry. The wire is yours." It was the first useful promise anyone had made her all day. Clara went to the boarding house, changed her green depot dress for a brown traveling skirt and fitted blue wool jacket, and collected the small field set she had purchased with 3 months of savings. The polished box held a key, sounder, wire, tools, and 2 glass battery jars packed in straw. Telegraphy was not merely employment to her, it was the work she meant to do for the rest of her life. At the livery, Luke lifted the field set only after she nodded. "Careful with the jars," she said. "I'm a bridge man. We worship anything that breaks when dropped." Despite herself, Clara smiled. They rode out as the sun touched the ridge. Luke's bay mare kept a patient pace beside Clara's gray. He did not fill the miles with questions about her childhood or tell her she was brave for doing the job she had done competently for 7 years. He asked how a stranger could enter the wire without the dispatcher hearing. Clara explained that a man could cut into a branch built for an old water station, feed it with his own battery, and imitate a division order. If he knew the schedule and the proper forms, distant operators might obey before anyone questioned him. "But you heard the difference," Luke said. "I heard a worn return spring in his key. It makes his R hesitate." "Like a bad hinge." "Exactly like a bad hinge." Luke glanced at her with quiet admiration. It warmed her more than a compliment about her face would have. At milepost 38, Clara stopped beside a line pole. The branch wire dipped toward the abandoned Juniper water station, a cluster of weathered buildings below the ridge. She unpacked the field set and asked Luke to scrape the oxide from a connection. He worked carefully while she attached the pocket sounder. The metal arm gave a faint, uneven click. Clara listened with her eyes closed. Nothing. Then 3 slow taps came through, not an order, a line test. Someone was checking whether the branch remained alive. She answered with the old call sign for Juniper, then deliberately made her final letter clumsy. The stranger corrected it. Luke's eyes narrowed. He knows the old station code. And he thinks whoever is here belongs to him? Clara sent one more question. Or extra 14 delayed? The answer came quickly. Proceed as listed, 6 o'clock tomorrow. Then the wire went dead. Clara wrote every tap in her notebook. There is no or extra 14 on tomorrow's public board. There was one today, Luke said. It lost a coupling at Santa Teresa. The passenger train took its time slot through Black Cut. The air seemed to thin around them. The false order had not been meant for the passenger train. It had been meant for a silver ore extra. Luke looked toward the abandoned relay hut below. Someone planned to put that ore train where it did not belong. And when the schedule changed, Samuel Croft died in its place. They reached Juniper at dusk. The relay hut stood beside a dry water tank, its door hanging crooked. Inside, dust covered the desk except for a clean rectangle where a telegraph key had recently rested. Copper wire disappeared through a fresh hole in the wall. On the floor lay a broken brass spring. Clara knelt beside it. A return spring. The bad hinge? Part of it. The metal was newly snapped and bright at the break. She wrapped it in a square of cloth and placed it in her notebook. Luke found hoof marks behind the hut and wagon tracks leading south, away from the railroad. A spent match lay near the threshold. He bent to pick it up, then froze. Clara. Kerosene ran in a dark line beneath the desk. Flame climbed the back wall before they reached the door, crackling through the dry boards. Luke threw his shoulder against the warped boards and forced them open. Clara snatched the field set, but smoke rolled down, hot and black. A burning roof strip fell between them. "Leave the box!" Luke shouted. "The notebook is inside it!" She kicked the strip aside with her boot, seized the handle, and dragged the box clear. Luke covered her with his coat as the window burst outward. They stumbled into the dirt together. The hut burned fast, consuming the splice, the table, and whatever records the stranger had left. Luke's right palm was blistered where he had caught the falling board. Clara's cheek stung from the heat, but her notebook and the broken spring were safe. "You could have lost your hand," she said. "You could have lost the only written copy of that exchange." "That does not make your hand replaceable." "Nor you." The words passed between them without decoration. Clara looked away first. They watered the horses and wrapped Luke's palm with a clean strip torn from the lining of her field kit cover. As she worked, he watched her hands. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Less when you're angry." "I am not angry." "Then I am in terrible danger." She laughed once, unexpectedly, and tied the bandage. In the firelight, Luke picked up a charred scrap that had blown from the hut. It was part of a routing board. Most of the chalk had vanished, but 2 train numbers remained cut into the wood. 14 and 7. A heavy line joined both to Juniper Spur. Passenger number 7 had been substituted for ore extra 14. The opening disaster changed shape. The sender had not chosen a passenger train. He had planned to divert silver ore to the abandoned spur, where wagons could take the cargo south before the railroad knew it was missing. The schedule change had turned theft into murder. Only someone with access to the division movements could have known when the ore train ran. Only someone with control over the inquiry could erase the evidence. They rode back under a moon sharp enough to silver the rails. Near town, Luke asked why Vale disliked her. "He dislikes anyone who keeps a better record than he does," Clara said. "That is not the whole of it." She was quiet for several hoofbeats. "Last winter I found freight numbers changed after transmission. Small changes. A car of tools became farm iron. A locked crate became scrap. Vale called them clerical errors and told me a woman should not confuse suspicion with intelligence." Luke's jaw hardened. "I kept copies," she continued. "Then my desk was searched. Nothing was taken." "That frightened me more." "Because they wanted to know what you knew." "Yes." At the edge of town, a broadside had already been nailed to the depot wall. It declared Clara responsible for unauthorized transmissions and claimed she had fled rather than face the inquiry. Vale had signed it. Men and women gathered beneath the lantern to read. One injured passenger, his head wrapped in linen, stared at Clara with open disgust. Samuel Croft's older sister stood apart, her hands locked around a black shawl. "You have nerve coming back," someone said. Clara dismounted. One cruel sentence would have been easier than the silence that followed. She had served these people through blizzards, births, cattle sales, deaths, and distant wars reported line by line. Tonight, a printed lie outweighed 7 years of truth. Vale came through the depot door with railroad guard Hank Duran behind him. "Miss Wynn has stolen company equipment and trespassed on the right-of-way," Vale announced. "Take the field box." Luke stepped between Duran and Clara's saddle. "You will need a county warrant," he said. "You no longer speak for this railroad." "I speak for my own hands. They carried 6 people out of your wreck." Vale's face tightened. "And now those hands are interfering with an investigation." Clara moved beside Luke, not behind him. She opened the field box herself and took out the notebook. "Then investigate this." She read the exchange with the unknown operator aloud. She showed the broken spring. Luke held up the charred routing board. Vale barely glanced at either. "Objects gathered without witnesses," he said. "A story composed by a dismissed employee and a bitter foreman." "I witnessed it," Luke replied. "You are compromised." The accusation worked. Doubt moved through the crowd. Then engineer Frank Dalton came out of the hotel on crutches. His face was bruised, one arm strapped against his chest. "Clara warned my train off a broken bridge 2 winters ago," he said. "She did it because she heard ice singing on the line wire. Vale called that imagination too, until we found the pier split." He stopped beside her. "I will witness whatever test she makes." Samuel Croft's sister raised her eyes. "Can you prove who sent the order?" Clara wanted to promise. Instead, she gave the truth. "I can prove where the next one comes from." Vale laughed, but the sound was too quick. The examiner would arrive at noon. Clara had 14 hours. She and Luke worked in the back room of the newspaper office because its owner, Mrs. Della Pike, kept an independent wire to the territorial capital. Clara compared her copies of altered freight messages with the public movement board. Again and again, missing cargo had passed Red Mesa on days when a Juniper ore extra was listed. Luke spread a track map across the table. "The old Juniper branch returns here." He pointed to a warehouse beside Vale's private freight yard. "That building used to store relay batteries." Clara traced the inked line. The warehouse had no reason to remain connected. Yet, if the old branch entered there before joining the depot, a man inside could send orders onto the railroad wire. "We do not need to catch him riding away from a burned hut," she said. "We make the wire name him." Her plan required 3 witnesses and exact timing. At 11:45, Pollard would disconnect the main line east of the depot. Luke would open the west connection at the water tower. That would leave only the abandoned Juniper branch attached to Clara's field battery. Every legitimate station would be physically cut off. If a signal still reached the depot sounder, it could come from only one place: the hidden branch through Vale's warehouse. Luke studied the map, then Clara. "Vale will never let Pollard help. Pollard already knows my W closes high. He has been afraid longer than I have." They found the station agent alone before dawn. Pollard's collar was wilted, and his eyes were red. At first he denied everything. Then Clara placed the broken spring on his desk. "You copied the movement boards for someone," she said. "Maybe you thought they were stealing ore. Maybe you did not know a train would wreck. But if you help Vale silence the line now, the next death belongs partly to you." Pollard covered his face. He had copied schedules for Vale in exchange for money to settle gambling debts. Vale claimed the figures were for a freight audit. Pollard had never sent a false order, and had not known about the hidden key until the crash. After the wreck, he had seen Rafe Morrow enter Vale's warehouse by the rear door. Morrow was a former relief operator from Juniper, dismissed 2 years earlier for drinking on duty. Pollard had told himself the man was only collecting freight. Now he understood whose Dragdar Clara had heard. "He moved the payroll special to 6 tonight," Pollard whispered. "He said the examiner would delay regular traffic, so the special should run early." Clara felt cold. The exchange from Juniper had said 6 o'clock tomorrow. Vale intended one final theft after the inquiry, when everyone believed the line secure. Pollard agreed to disconnect the east wire and testify, but before noon, Vale discovered them. He entered the depot with guard Duran and 2 line hands. Behind him came Territorial Examiner Edwin Sutter, dust-covered from the morning stage. Vale had advanced the hearing. "Miss Wynn is attempting to tamper with the line again," Vale said. "I recommend immediate detention." Sutter was a spare, gray-haired man who studied Clara before speaking. "Do you have evidence, Miss Wynn?" "I have a test." "She has a performance," Vale cut in. Clara laid her notebook, the broken spring, the charred routing board, and her old freight copies on the public counter. "Then let the public watch it." Vale ordered Duran to clear the room. Examiner Sutter stopped him. "A public accusation may have a public answer." By noon, the depot was crowded. Samuel's sister stood near Engineer Dalton. Mrs. Pike held a watch. Pollard waited at the east connection, pale but resolved. Luke stood by the west wire with a wrench in his bandaged hand. Clara returned to the desk from which her nameplate had been torn. She set her field battery beneath it and connected the sounder. At 11:58, Pollard opened the east line. At 11:59, Luke opened the west. The sounder became silent. Clara faced the crowd. "No legitimate station can reach this instrument now. Mason Ridge is cut off. Santa Teresa is cut off. The division office is cut off. Only the old Juniper branch remains." Vale folded his arms. "Assuming your wiring is honest." Mr. Sutter inspected it himself. The examiner nodded. Noon came. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. Vale smiled. Then the sounder snapped down and clicked out the same order, line clear through black cut, proceed Juniper. The dragged R shuddered through the depot. Every face turned toward Clara. She did not touch the key. The signal repeated. Clara lifted the field battery lead. The sounder stopped in the middle of a word. She replaced it. The clicking resumed. "The sender is on the Juniper branch," she said, "and that branch terminates in Mr. Vale's warehouse." Vale moved first. He swept the field battery from beneath the desk. Luke caught the box before the glass jars struck the floor. Clara seized the loose wire and pressed it back to the binding post. The final word came through. Proceed. Vale reached for the cutters behind the desk, the same cutters Luke had taken from him the night before. Luke closed his bandaged hand over Vale's wrist. "You have tried that once." This time, guard Duran stepped away from Vale. Examiner Sutter ordered the warehouse opened. They crossed the freight yard as one body, railroad men, townspeople, injured passengers, and Samuel Croft's sister. Vale protested until Duran took his arm. Pollard produced the warehouse key. Inside, a gaunt man jerked away from the hidden telegraph set and ran for the rear door. Guard Duran caught Rafe Morrow before he reached the freight ramp. The key was still warm from use. Its brass return spring had been repaired with a crooked strip cut from a clock spring. When Clara pressed the R, the key dragged exactly as the false signal had dragged. Beside it stood crates bearing erased freight marks, sacks of silver concentrate, and the missing express seals from 6 shipments. A movement board on the wall listed train numbers in Pollard's handwriting. Vale's private account book lay open beneath it. The evidence was no longer a frightened woman's word against a superintendent's title. It was a signal, a route, a key, and stolen cargo in one locked room. Vale broke free of Doran and lunged for the account book. Clara reached it first. He stopped inches from her, breathing hard. For years he had mistaken softness for surrender. Now the whole town watched him discover the difference. "You cannot understand what it takes to keep a division profitable," he said. "I understand exactly what it cost," Clara replied. "Samuel Croft paid it." Vale lowered his eyes. Pollard's confession completed the chain. Vale had given copied schedules to Rafe Morrow, who diverted valuable freight onto Juniper Spur, where hired wagons carried it south. When Ore Extra 14 failed, Vale allowed the passenger train to inherit its movement slot, rather than cancel the prepared false order. He had expected confusion, not a collision. Afterward, he forged Clara's initials and fired her before she could compare records. The second false signal had been sent to keep the secret operator's schedule and to make Clara appear desperate. The third was intended to divert the payroll special after the inquiry. Examiner Sutter placed Vale and Morrow under the county deputy's custody. Duran surrendered his badge long enough to escort his former employer across the yard. Justice did not repair Black Cut in an afternoon. It did not bring Samuel back or take pain from the injured, but it began with honest accounting. The railroad recovered enough stolen freight to establish a relief fund for the victims. Pollard lost his station post and faced charges for falsifying records, though his testimony spared him the harshest consequence. Every order on the Red Mesa division would now carry a registered number, a repeat from a second station, and the sending operator's witnessed signature. No superintendent could close an inquiry alone. Clara wrote those conditions herself. When the railroad offered to restore her old position, she refused. "The old position allowed one man to erase my record," she told Sutter. "I will return as chief operator, with authority to audit train orders and stop traffic when confirmation fails." Sutter considered it. Then he extended his hand. "Chief Operator Wynn." The applause began with Engineer Dalton. Samuel's sister joined last, tears shining on her face. After the crowd dispersed, she approached Clara at the depot desk. "I blamed you because I needed the answer to have a face," she said. Clara took her hands. So did Vale. There was no easy forgiveness between them, only a truthful beginning. Sometimes that was the most mercy grief could bear. Luke waited outside while Clara finished the final safety order. He had been offered his bridge post again, but he accepted only after Sutter agreed that every structural closure would be entered on Clara's line register. The railroad had learned that his hands and her signals belonged to the same work, neither beneath the other. Weeks later, Black Cut reopened beneath a clear September sky. New rails shone through the curve. A memorial plate for Samuel Croft stood beside the water tower, paid for by the recovered freight fund rather than by his family. Clara sat at a larger desk in the rebuilt depot office. Her brass nameplate had been polished and fixed to the front. Chief Operator Clara Wynn. The new sounder clicked cleanly. Line clear through Black Cut. Clara repeated the order, checked its number, and waited for Mason Ridge to confirm. Only then did she sign her high-closing W. Luke leaned in the doorway, hat in hand. His palm had healed, leaving a pale line across it. "Is the line clear all the way to supper?" he asked. She looked at the clock. "That depends. Who is directing the movement?" "You are." He said it without jest, and the quiet certainty in his gray eyes drew her from the desk. During the weeks of repair, affection had grown between them by useful inches. Coffee left beside a midnight register, his coat over her shoulders only after he asked, her hand resting in his when neither needed to prove anything. He had never asked her to leave the wire. She had never asked him to become less restless than the man she had chosen. Luke held out his uninjured hand. "Clara, I have spent most of my life building ways across difficult ground. I would like to build the next one with you. Slowly, if you prefer. Honestly, either way." She let him wait. That mattered. The choice was hers, made after her name, work, and future had been restored, not bought with rescue and not owed for protection. Then she placed her hand in his. "Supper first," she said. "The rest, slowly." His smile deepened the weathered lines around his eyes. "Yes, ma'am." Clara locked the office and stepped onto the platform beside him. Behind them, the sounder rested in honest silence. Ahead, the rails caught the last gold light and carried it west. This time, Clara chose where the line would lead.